Umræðan mannréttindi og ólögleg vímuefni verður háværari hér á Íslandi sem á annar staðar í heiminum, en gestur okkar í Íslandi í dag einmitt sérfræðingur í þeim málefnum. Gestur okkar að þessu sinni Damon Barrett, framkvæmdastjóri alþjóðlegrar miðstöðvar mannréttindi og stefnumótunar í fíkniefnamálum við University of Iceland í Bretlandi, og hann kominn hingað til lands til að flytja fyrirlestur í Háskóla Íslands, Háskólatorgi á morgun klukkan 16:30 á vegum Snarrotin-ICLU, samtaka borgaraleg réttindi. Damon, welcome to Iceland í dag, as we call it, or Iceland today.
Thank you very much.
Human rights and drug policy, that's an issue that is maybe not daily on people's tongue.
No.
People would think, there are laws about drugs, there are illegal drugs.
Yeah.
If you use them, you have broken the law.
Sure.
And therefore you should take the penalty. Isn't that simple?
Yeah, I think that's part of my talk on Thursday, in fact, which is that we take these things for granted. It's been in the law for so long that maybe we've not stopped to think about why we're doing this and what are the consequences of the way we're going about doing it. But really today, the human rights consequences of the criminal and very punitive approach to drugs, I think, is becoming more and more common knowledge. A cursory Google search really will uncover any number of human rights problems in relation to drug control. We can do it in numbers, really. You can count it in millions, in thousands, in hundreds of thousands that are in some way abused or their life chances, their opportunities curtailed because of the way we're approaching drugs.
Name an example how it is, if we start just with our hemisphere here, in Europe. We kind of look at it that this is a small problem with a very small group of society.
Sure. And
that doesn't touch normal people. It's some kind of outcast or unnormal people that use illegal drugs.
Yeah, well, I mean, first of all, that's kind of false. A lot of us have, at least in some point in our lives, tried these drugs, and there is a real underlying hypocrisy then to the way that we deal with these things, because my drug use is not as bad as your drug use. And this is why a human rights angle on this is important, because even one person abused in this way or singled out and stigmatized in that way is worthy of consideration. Let me give some examples from Europe though. Across the entire European region, 1 in 4 women in prison are there for non-violent drug offences. That's a disproportionately high number for non-violent drug offences, and we have to ask why we're doing that. A lot of them are from quite poor economic backgrounds. A lot of them are parents, and we really need to think about the long-term consequences and the value of imprisoning women for those kinds of offences, or anybody for that matter. And that's just prisons. Yeah,
and then people talk, when it comes to that numbers you're mentioning, you talk about hypocrisy, people kind of also categorize which drugs you abuse.
Sure.
So in those numbers there are people abusing or using cannabis up to cocaine, heroin?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, different countries will approach these in different ways. I live in Sweden, and there cannabis is considered very, very serious. I mean, really contrary to most scientific evidence, but it's a long-term societal and cultural concern with cannabis. So that's very high on the agenda. In other countries, cannabis isn't so much. I personally, and from my own research and from a human rights perspective, don't see the categorization of drugs in that way as all that relevant in terms of how we construct our international policies, which is where my area of focus is. It's because what we've allowed governments to do is to take control of what should be a very technical question. In the past, you've interviewed Professor David Nutt, who talked about categorizing risk and harm. That's fine, and we need to do it. But to give that into a political process is a very dangerous thing to do, because all of these prejudices and biases start to completely infect the process.
So, which human rights are the most commonly abused by authorities?
Well, it depends on where you are. But if we're in one part of the region, for example, up to 1,000 people are executed every year for drug offences. So we can talk about that. But in this part of the world, I've studied and I've looked into torture, we've looked into arbitrary detention, we've looked into human displacement, and all of these things are happening because of drug enforcement. But here we can look at the day-to-day encroachments on people's rights. My right to privacy, for example. What is the government's justification for not allowing me to do something on an ongoing basis? Now, I'm not saying they can't infringe on people's privacy, the governments do it all the time, but the burden is on them to justify the infringement. And in this case, there was never any other option on the table. No other less restrictive ways to achieve societal health goals than to stop everybody doing these things forever. The policy objective here is that this should never ever stop. That's a very, very strange thing to do if you had some kind of a health agenda. So there's the day-to-day encroachments on my privacy and yours. Then there's the encroachments into our children's schools in terms of random school drug testing, sniffer dogs, even strip searches in some cases. These things are places where government interference has gone far too far when it comes to drugs. There are other ways to deal with these issues.
Yeah. Here in Iceland, of course, we have examples of police going into certain kind of concerts, especially rock concerts, pop concerts, but they don't show up with sniffer dogs for symphony concerts. They might find something there also, maybe, if they did.
If they did, I can't comment too much on what they would do, but it seems to me that the kind of people they might be speaking to might be more aware of their rights and more willing to
So
complain.
it's also profiling in this?
There's definitely a profiling. In this country, it seems to be profiling young people who listen to the wrong music and wear the wrong clothes, or maybe for them the right clothes. In the UK, it's profiling of young black men, where in the UK, somebody is stopped and searched for drugs every minute. Colleagues at an NGO called Release and the London School of Economics did some research on this recently, and it's comprehensively racist in its execution. So there's profiling of all sorts that go on in relation to drugs.
So are black people, for example, in the UK, are they proportionally more frequent in jail than Caucasians?
Considerably more. If they're more likely to be stopped, if they're stopped, they're more likely to be charged. If they're charged, they're more likely to get a more heavy sentence. The racism is throughout the system, really.
Yeah.
And it's each of the police forces in the UK, there are lots of them, we're all implicated in this. Some better than others, but the worst was by far the Metropolitan Police in London. And this mirrors the situation in the United States. I think it's more common knowledge that the incarceration rates in the United States are hugely biased towards incarcerating young black and Latino men.
Yeah. We have had numbers in our previous interviews on the same issues, that there are more people in jail in US than ever was in the gulags in the Soviet Union.
Right, or another way to look at it is that there's more people in prison for drugs in the US than in the European Union for all offences. And there's more people in the European Union. That's another way to look at it. There are, in some countries, half of the people in prisons are there for non-violent drug offences. These things need to be very carefully considered as to whether there are ongoing debates about the usefulness of prison for certain kinds of offences anyway.
And that, of course, have consequences for the people who are jailed.
Sure.
It's also expensive for the state usually to take care of all those prisoners. But what are, for a young person, for example, that goes into jail for minor use of drugs, that has consequences that affects their human rights in the future?
Yeah, and not just prison. Bear in mind that I've mentioned some UK statistics, so I'll keep with that. 70,000 or so criminal records were handed out last year for possession. 70,000. Here, since the beginning of the prohibitionist model, we might be looking at 20 to 30,000 criminal records. Now, some of those are expunged after a certain period of time, but they damage all sorts of chances around education, getting grants, getting into certain countries, getting jobs. These things are, in some countries, those criminal records don't go away. Now, that really damages your life chances from then on. And really, when we think about it, if it's for possession, for personal use, for what?
Yeah. Public opinion, of course, has a lot to say in this, because politicians are vulnerable for public opinion. In decades in the past, there has been scaremongering around drugs. that drugs are usually connected with serious crimes, serious criminals, really, that are using the drugs. But the discussion seems to be changing, and people or individuals are knowing more about the rights you've been mentioning, the right to privacy and so on.
Mm-hmm.
How can people really move this forward to the public? How can the public move this forward, that the police and the politicians respect, the respect
Sure.
their human rights?
Sure. I think one of the first things that needs to start is changing the way we talk about drugs. What I'll argue on Thursday is that what we have at the moment is talking about drugs as if it's a threat to our way of living. You see this in international law. Drugs are referred to, or drug addiction, as is said in the relevant international treaties, is referred to as an evil and as a threat to the fabric of society.
And therefore the state should have
Sure.
more weapons to tackle it.
Right. Well, if you imagine you're in government and you set up a threat of that scale. You say this is a real threat to our kids, which we hear a lot. The public will expect nothing less than meeting that threat. What else are you going to do? You cannot say there's a threat, an imminent threat to our way of living, and we're not really going to do much about it. You can't do that. What that leads to is a massive, disproportionate policy focus and budget focus, spending on enforcement instead of on health, which is where we should be focusing our resources. And the spending on health is grotesquely low. I'll give you an example of that. Yesterday, a report was released by my old organization. It's called Harm Reduction International. The report is the global state of harm reduction. Now, if we were to spend enough money, we could meet the global HIV prevention need for people who inject drugs. Yeah. Okay, it's estimated at something like $2 to $3 billion. Yeah. A tenth of enforcement spending around the world will cover that 4 times over. Yeah. Now, that's just a tenth.
Yeah. Just a short time left. United Nations are going to tackle this in next year.
Yeah.
So what should a country like Iceland, and what should even the Nordic countries, you live in Sweden, the Nordic countries usually work together, but the Swedish policy on drugs is really harsh. What can a small country like Iceland contribute to the United Nations Assembly next year?
I think this is going to be a big summit on drugs, the first in about 20 years. And I think the best way to look at it from a human rights perspective is that it's going to be something of a line in the sand. I think some decades down the road, this whole system's going to change. And there's going to be some that were on the wrong side of that, the wrong side of history, the wrong side of human rights. And I think the Nordic countries have led on some really key human rights progress over time in relation to business and human rights, counterterrorism and so on. Yeah. And this is one of those moments. And I think Iceland needs to get itself on the right side of history.
So that's a big chance to do that.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Damon Barrett, time is over. Thank you very much for coming to Ísland í dag.
You're welcome.
And of course people can listen to you in the University of Iceland tomorrow.
Absolutely.
Ísland í dag. Þá lokið að sinni, verið þið sæl.